The morning mist clung to the hills surrounding Cedar Valley as Sheriff Daniel Hawkins led his posse of 6 deputies toward the Blackwood Children's Work Farm, a grim institution that had operated under the guise of charitable rehabilitation. While systematically exploiting the children placed in its care, the early dawn light cast eerie shadows across the landscape as Daniel's jaw tightened with determination, knowing that what they were about to discover would test every principle he had sworn to uphold as a lawman, but understanding that justice demanded action regardless of the powerful interests protecting this operation. Daniel Hawkins was a man of 38, whose reputation for integrity and courage had made him the youngest sheriff in territorial history. Someone who had built his career on the belief that the law existed to protect the innocent rather than serve the wealthy. His weathered face showed the lines that came from making difficult decisions under pressure, but his dark eyes held the kind of unwavering moral clarity that had made him legendary among those who valued justice over political convenience. "Sheriff," called out Deputy John Parker as they crested a hill that brought the Blackwood facility into clear view. "Looks like they've got children working in the quarry already and the sun's barely up. Some of those boys can't be more than 8 years old." Daniel raised his spyglass and studied the scene below, his expression growing grimmer as he watched dozens of children hauling rocks and operating machinery that should have been handled by grown men. The work farm had been the subject of numerous complaints over the past 2 years, but Edgar Blackwood's connections to territorial politicians had always managed to deflect serious investigation until federal authorities finally decided to intervene. "This ends today," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that made his deputies understand they were about to witness something that would define their careers. "We have federal warrants for Blackwood and his entire operation, plus authorization to remove any child showing signs of abuse or unsafe working conditions." The federal investigation that had led to this moment had been triggered by the desperate testimony of a boy who had escaped from the facility 6 months earlier. His account of systematic brutality finally providing prosecutors with the evidence needed to move against an operation that had been hiding behind charitable pretenses for nearly a decade. As they approached the main gate of the compound, Daniel could see the fear in the eyes of the children working in the quarry, their thin bodies and ragged clothes telling a story of neglect and exploitation that made his blood boil with righteous anger. Most disturbing was the way they immediately stopped working and cowered when they saw the approaching riders, behavior that suggested conditioning through harsh punishment rather than normal childhood development. "Federal marshals," Daniel called out as they reached the administration building, his voice carrying across the compound with unmistakable authority. "We have warrants for the arrest of Edgar Blackwood and his staff, plus court orders for the immediate inspection of this facility and the welfare of all children in residence." Edgar Blackwood emerged from the main building, flanked by 2 guards, his expensive clothes and well-fed appearance contrasting sharply with the obvious poverty and neglect of the children under his supposed care. He was a man of 55 whose political connections had made him wealthy through government contracts for child rehabilitation services that amounted to little more than legalized slavery. "This is an outrage," Blackwood protested, his voice rising with the kind of indignation that guilty men often displayed when finally confronted with their crimes. "These children are here under proper legal authority, placed by territorial courts, for their own moral development. You have no right to interfere with legitimate rehabilitation efforts." Daniel's response was to produce the federal warrants, their official seals representing the power of a government that had finally decided to investigate reports of systematic child abuse. "Mr. Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, child endangerment, and operating an illegal labor camp. Your guards and supervisors are also under arrest." The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive, with Blackwood's hired muscle quickly realizing that resistance to federal marshals would only compound their legal problems. As the adults were arrested and shackled, Daniel turned his attention to the real victims, the frightened children who had been watching the proceedings with expressions that mixed hope and terror in equal measure. "Children," Daniel said gently, removing his hat and kneeling down to appear less intimidating. "You're safe now. No one is going to hurt you anymore, and no one is going to force you to work in dangerous conditions." The response was not the relief Daniel had expected, but rather increased fear, as many of the children seemed to expect punishment for the disruption their rescue had caused. Years of brutal conditioning had taught them that any change in routine typically resulted in increased suffering, and they had no experience with adults who actually wanted to help them. It was then that Daniel noticed a group of 6 boys standing together near the quarry's edge, their positioning suggesting they had formed some kind of protective alliance during their time at the facility. The oldest appeared to be about 15, with sandy hair and intelligent eyes that held wariness far beyond his years. Beside him stood boys who ranged in age from about 13 down to what couldn't have been more than 9 years old, all showing the same combination of fierce loyalty to each other and deep suspicion of adult authority. "What are your names?" Daniel asked the group gently, approaching slowly with his hands visible and his voice soft. "I'm Thomas Sullivan," the oldest boy said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of protective authority that suggested he had been functioning as a surrogate father to the younger children. "These are my brothers, Patrick, who's 13, Sean, who's 11, Michael and Kevin, who are twins and 10 years old, and little Brian, who's 9. The way Thomas introduced the group made it clear that while they might not share blood, these boys had formed a genuine family unit during their imprisonment, relying on each other for emotional support and physical protection in an environment designed to break their spirits. "How long have you boys been here?" Daniel asked, though he dreaded hearing the answer. 3 years for me and Patrick," Thomas replied, his young face showing the premature aging that came from bearing too much responsibility too early. 2 years for Sean, about 18 months for the twins, and Brian came last year when his parents died of fever. Daniel felt his heart clench as he realized these children had spent years enduring conditions that would have violated every standard of human decency, even by frontier standards where hardship was accepted as part of life. "Thomas," Daniel said, "carefully, you and your brothers are coming with me, all of you. I'm going to make sure you have proper homes where you'll be treated with the respect and kindness you deserve." "Together?" little Brian asked, his voice filled with desperate hope as he pressed closer to Thomas's protective presence. "Can we stay together? Thomas promised we'd always be a family, no matter what happened to us." The plea for family unity struck Daniel with unexpected force, and he found himself making a promise that would change his own life as dramatically as theirs. "Yes," Daniel said without hesitation, "you'll stay together. I give you my word on that, and I've never broken my word to a child." As the federal operation continued around them, processing arrests and beginning the complex task of placing nearly 50 abused children with suitable families, Daniel found himself studying the 6 boys who had somehow maintained their humanity and their bonds despite years of systematic cruelty. Thomas continued to position himself protectively in front of the younger boys, his watchful eyes constantly scanning for potential threats, even as he began to allow himself to hope that rescue might actually be real. Patrick stood ready to support Thomas's decisions while keeping the younger children calm through quiet reassurance. Sean showed signs of the quick intelligence that had probably helped him survive, while the twins maintained their close bond, and little Brian stayed near Thomas like a shadow, clearly viewing the older boy as his primary source of security in an unpredictable world. Sheriff Hawkins said Deputy Parker as he approached with documentation from the facility's closure. "We've got several families willing to take 1 or 2 children, but nobody's come forward who can handle 6 boys together, especially with the trauma they've experienced." The news confirmed Daniel's growing suspicion that keeping these boys together would require a solution that went beyond conventional placement procedures, and he found himself considering possibilities that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. "Send word to my housekeeper that she should prepare the spare rooms," Daniel said quietly, surprising his deputy with the implications of his decision. "These boys are coming home with me until we can find a permanent arrangement that keeps their family intact." The decision was made impulsively, driven by Daniel's recognition that these children needed stability and protection more than they needed bureaucratic procedures that would tear apart the only family bonds they had left. As a widower whose own children had died in a typhoid epidemic 5 years earlier, Daniel had never considered the possibility of suddenly becoming responsible for 6 traumatized boys, but something about their fierce loyalty to each other had awakened protective instincts he thought had died with his own family. "Are you certain about this, sir?" Thomas asked quietly, his mature understanding of adult responsibilities making him question whether Daniel truly comprehended the challenge he was accepting. "Son," Daniel replied with a smile that transformed his stern features, "I've spent 5 years feeling like my life ended when I lost my own children. Maybe it's time to discover that endings can also be beginnings, if you're brave enough to take the chance." As they prepared to leave the Blackwood facility forever, the 6 boys gathered their meager possessions and prepared to embark on a journey that would take them from the nightmare of exploitation to the possibility of genuine family love. The bond that had sustained them through their darkest hours was about to be tested in an entirely different way, as they learned whether the adult world contained people worthy of their trust and their affection. Daniel Hawkins's ranch house sat on a small rise overlooking Cedar Valley, its modest but well-maintained structure reflecting the practical sensibilities of a man who valued substance over show. As the wagon carrying 6 traumatized boys approached the home that would become their sanctuary, Daniel felt a mixture of determination and uncertainty about the enormous responsibility he had undertaken in bringing them here, rather than placing them in separate foster situations that would have been easier for everyone involved. Mrs. Catherine O'Malley, Daniel's Irish housekeeper, had been preparing for their arrival since receiving his message. Her maternal instincts immediately focused on the practical and emotional needs of children who had known nothing but cruelty from the adults who were supposed to protect them. She was a woman in her 50s whose own children were grown and scattered, and her excitement at the prospect of caring for young people again was evident in the way she had prepared bedrooms with fresh linens and the kitchen with enough food to feed a small army. "Saints preserve us," Mrs. O'Malley murmured, as she watched the boys climb down from the wagon, their thin frames and wary expressions telling the story of systematic abuse more clearly than any official report could have done. "Look at the poor darlings, barely more than skin and bones and afraid of their own shadows." Thomas immediately positioned himself between the younger boys and the adults, his protective instincts still operating at full alert despite Daniel's gentle treatment during their journey from the work farm. The 15-year-old had learned that survival depended on constant vigilance, and years of experience had taught him that adult kindness often preceded demands for payment that children couldn't afford to give. "Boys," Daniel said gently as they stood uncertainly in the yard, "this is Mrs. O'Malley, who helps me keep this place running. She's going to help you get settled and make sure you have everything you need." "Welcome home, my dears," Mrs. O'Malley said warmly, her Irish accent making even the simplest words sound like a blessing. "I've prepared rooms for all of you, and there's hot soup waiting in the kitchen. You look like you could use some proper feeding." Little Brian pressed closer to Thomas's side, overwhelmed by the kindness in the woman's voice, but still too frightened to fully believe that adults could be trusted to mean what they said. "Is it really safe here?" he whispered to his surrogate big brother. "We'll see," Thomas replied quietly, his mature caution serving him well as he assessed their new environment for potential threats and escape routes. But Sheriff Hawkins seems different from the adults we've known before. The house itself was a revelation to boys who had spent years sleeping in barrack-style dormitories with minimal heat and no privacy. Daniel showed them through rooms that were clean, comfortable, and obviously maintained with care, explaining that the two larger bedrooms could accommodate 3 boys each while still providing adequate space for their belongings and activities. "This is really where we're going to live?" Sean asked, his 11-year-old voice filled with wonder as he looked around a bedroom that was larger and better appointed than anything in his previous experience. "This is your home," Daniel replied firmly, "for as long as you want it to be. You have beds with clean sheets, warm clothes, regular meals, and most importantly, you have each other and adults who are committed to your welfare." Patrick, the 13-year-old whose sharp intelligence had helped him navigate the dangers of the work farm, studied Daniel's face with the kind of careful attention that had become second nature for all the boys. "Sir," he said quietly, "what do you expect from us in return? In our experience, nothing has ever been truly free." The question revealed the depth of cynicism that systematic abuse had created in children who should have been innocent and trusting, and Daniel felt his heart break a little as he realized how thoroughly their faith in adult goodness had been destroyed. "Patrick," Daniel said gently, "I expect you to be children. I expect you to eat when you're hungry, sleep when you're tired, play when you want to play, and gradually learn that not all adults are like the ones who hurt you." "And if we make mistakes?" Michael asked, one of the 10-year-old twins whose shared experiences with his brother Kevin had created a bond that had helped them survive their ordeal. "Then you'll learn from them and try to do better next time." Daniel replied simply, "Making mistakes is part of growing up, not a crime that deserves punishment." Mrs. O'Malley appeared in the doorway, with a tray laden with bowls of thick vegetable soup and slices of fresh bread, her timing perfect for interrupting the serious conversation with the promise of nourishment. "Come along, boys," she said with a smile that reached her eyes. "Let's get some proper food into you before you waste away to nothing." The sight of abundant food offered freely, without conditions, or the threat of having it withdrawn as punishment, seemed to overwhelm the boys, with emotions they had learned to suppress during their captivity. Brian actually began to cry at the simple kindness, while the twins looked at each other with expressions of disbelief that suggested they could barely comprehend their change in circumstances. "It's all right to feel whatever you're feeling," Daniel said gently, recognizing their need to process emotions that had been denied expression for so long. "You're safe here, and you don't have to pretend to be stronger than you are." Over the following weeks, as the boys gradually adapted to the rhythms of normal family life, Daniel began to understand both the depth of trauma they had endured and the remarkable strength they had shown in protecting each other through the worst of it. Thomas revealed himself to be not just protective, but genuinely wise, someone who had maintained his moral compass despite everything he had suffered. Patrick possessed a natural intelligence that had been starved for intellectual stimulation, while Sean showed artistic talents that had been completely suppressed at the work farm. The twins, Michael and Kevin, demonstrated the kind of resilience that came from having each other for support, and little Brian began to show glimpses of the playful child he might have been under different circumstances. "Sheriff Hawkins," Thomas said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "I want you to know that we understand this arrangement might not be permanent. We're grateful for whatever time you can give us, but we won't make demands that you can't meet." The mature acceptance of uncertainty in a 15-year-old boy struck Daniel with its sad wisdom, revealing how thoroughly the boy's expectations had been shaped by a lifetime of disappointment and abandonment. "Thomas," Daniel said carefully, "I need you to understand something. I didn't bring you boys here as a temporary measure while I figured out what to do with you. I brought you here because I hoped you might consider staying permanently, becoming part of my family. But you barely know us," Patrick protested, his sharp mind immediately identifying the logical problems with such an arrangement. "How can you make such a commitment to 6 boys who come with so much baggage and problems?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering how to explain feelings that he was still processing himself. "Because you boys have already shown me something I thought I'd lost forever," he said finally. "You've shown me what family looks like when it's built on choice rather than just biology, when people decide to care for each other because it's the right thing to do, rather than because they have to." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a rider approaching the ranch at high speed, clearly bearing urgent news that couldn't wait for normal channels of communication. As the horseman drew closer, they could see it was Deputy Martinez, from town, whose presence typically meant official business that required Daniel's immediate attention. "Sheriff Hawkins," Deputy Martinez called out as he reined in his horse, "I've got news from the territorial capital about the Blackwood case. The governor wants to see you and the boys to discuss testimony for the federal trials." The prospect of having to relive their traumatic experiences in a courtroom setting visibly distressed the younger boys, but Thomas straightened his shoulders, with the kind of determination that had helped him survive everything else. "If our testimony can help convict the people who hurt us and prevent other children from suffering the same way," Thomas said firmly, "then we'll do whatever is necessary." Daniel felt a surge of pride at the boy's courage, but also protective concern for all 6 boys who had already endured more than any children should have to face. "We'll face it together," Daniel said quietly, "as a family. Whatever comes next, you won't have to handle it alone." The promise of family support through future challenges seemed to give the boys strength they hadn't possessed as isolated individuals. And Daniel began to understand that their bond with each other and their growing trust in him represented something powerful enough to overcome even the worst experiences of their past. As they prepared for the legal battles ahead and the continued process of building trust and healing, Daniel realized that rescuing 6 boys from a brutal work farm had given him something far more valuable than the satisfaction of successful law enforcement. It had given him a family built on conscious choice rather than biological accident, and the opportunity to discover that love could indeed triumph over the worst that human cruelty could inflict. Subscribe to our channel now to see how this incredible family faces their challenges together and builds something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Don't miss the final chapter. 3 years had passed since Sheriff Daniel Hawkins first brought 6 traumatized boys home from the Blackwood work farm, and the transformation in all their lives during that time was profound beyond anything any of them could have imagined. When they were just beginning to learn what family could mean when built on love, rather than mere biology. The modest ranch house had been expanded to accommodate their growing needs, but more importantly, it had become a true home, filled with laughter, learning, and the kind of deep bonds that made every challenge bearable when faced together. Thomas, now 18, had grown into a young man whose character reflected both his natural leadership abilities and the stability that 3 years of genuine family life had provided. He was preparing to attend the Territorial Teachers College, inspired by Daniel's example of using authority to protect others, and determined to help children who had experienced trauma similar to his own. His plan was to return and establish schools specifically designed for children who needed extra support and understanding. Patrick, at 16, had revealed himself to be a gifted scholar whose intellectual hunger had been nurtured through private tutoring that Daniel had arranged. With the territory's finest educators, his analytical mind and deep sense of justice were already attracting attention from territorial attorneys who recognized his potential for legal work that could protect children's rights. Sean, now 14, had blossomed as an artist whose paintings, of frontier life, captured both its beauty and its harshness with remarkable skill for someone so young. Daniel had arranged for his work to be displayed in the territorial capital, where it had attracted attention from collectors who appreciated both his technical ability and his unique perspective on childhood resilience. The twins, Michael and Kevin, now 13, had maintained their close bond while developing distinctly different personalities and interests. Michael had inherited Daniel's practical problem-solving abilities and showed natural talent for engineering and construction, while Kevin possessed a gift for music that had been nurtured through lessons with traveling musicians who passed through Cedar Valley. Little Brian, no longer quite so little at 12, had evolved into the family's peacemaker and storyteller, someone whose traumatic early experiences had left him with deep empathy for others and a talent for helping people understand each other's perspectives through narrative and gentle humor. "Daniel," Thomas said one spring evening as the family gathered on the expanded porch to watch the sunset, using the informal address that had evolved naturally as he matured into young adulthood. "I want you to know that everything I've accomplished, and everything I hope to achieve in the future, started with your decision to keep us together instead of letting us be separated into different homes." The expression of gratitude carried special weight because it came from someone old enough to understand the full implications of the choices that had been made during those crucial early months of their family formation. "Thomas," Daniel replied, with the kind of paternal pride that had become one of the greatest joys of his life, "you boys taught me that the most important rescue work isn't about fighting criminals or enforcing laws. It's about creating safe spaces where people can heal and discover who they're meant to become." Mrs. O'Malley, now officially part of the family rather than just an employee, emerged from the kitchen with a tray of her famous apple pie, her maternal satisfaction evident as she watched the young men who had become like sons to her, despite the lack of blood relationship. "Look at my boys," she said with obvious affection, "growing up to be fine men who will make this world a better place because they understand what it means to suffer and what it means to be saved by love." The mention of their early suffering no longer brought the sharp pain it once had, but rather a gentle acknowledgement of experiences that had shaped them without defining them, and gratitude for the second chance they had all received to build something meaningful from the ashes of their early losses. "Mrs. O'Malley," Brian said with the formal courtesy that had become his trademark, "do you think our first families would approve of the family we've built together? Do you think they would understand that loving Daniel doesn't diminish our love for the parents we lost?" "Dear boy," Mrs. O'Malley replied gently, "love isn't a finite resource that gets used up when you share it. Your first parents gave you the foundation of love that helped you recognize goodness when you found it again. Sheriff Hawkins gave you safety and the chance to grow into who you were meant to become. Both kinds of love are precious, and both deserve to be honored." Their peaceful evening was interrupted by the arrival of a visitor riding up the ranch road, someone traveling with purpose rather than urgency. As the rider drew closer, they could see it was Judge Margaret Harrison from the Territorial Court, whose presence typically meant official business related to Daniel's law enforcement work or legal matters affecting their family. "Sheriff Hawkins," Judge Harrison called out as she dismounted from her horse, "I hope you don't mind my visiting unannounced, but I have some news that I wanted to share with you and the boys personally." "Of course not, Judge Harrison," Daniel, replied, standing to greet one of the territory's most respected legal authorities. "You're always welcome here. What news brings you out to our ranch?" "It's about the federal legislation that grew out of the Blackwood case," Judge Harrison said, with obvious satisfaction. "Congress has passed the Child Welfare Protection Act, establishing national standards for institutional care and creating oversight mechanisms to prevent the kind of abuse you boys experienced." The news that their testimony and experiences had contributed to federal legislation protecting other children filled all 6 boys with a sense of purpose and accomplishment that went far beyond personal healing. More importantly, Judge Harrison continued, the legislation specifically recognizes innovative family arrangements like yours as preferred alternatives to institutional placement and provides federal funding to support families willing to keep sibling groups together. The official recognition that their chosen family represented a model worth supporting and replicating was deeply meaningful to all of them, confirming that what they had built together had value beyond their own happiness. "There's one more thing," Judge Harrison added with a smile that suggested particularly good news was coming. "The territorial governor has asked me to discuss with Thomas the possibility of a full scholarship to law school, with the understanding that his unique background and experiences would make him an invaluable advocate for children's rights. The opportunity to pursue advanced education that would allow him to protect other children from experiences similar to his own was everything Thomas had hoped for, but had never dared to expect." "I would be honored to accept," Thomas said formally, though his voice carried excitement that was evident to everyone who knew him well. "But only if I can return here to practice law, so I can continue to be part of this family while using my education to help others." "That's exactly what the governor was hoping to hear," Judge Harrison replied approvingly. "The territory needs attorneys who understand that law should serve justice rather than just process, and who have personal experience with the systems they're trying to reform." As Judge Harrison departed and the family settled into their evening routines, Daniel found himself reflecting on how dramatically his life had been changed by a single decision to keep 6 traumatized boys together rather than allowing them to be separated by bureaucratic convenience. 2 years later, as Thomas graduated from law school and prepared to return to Cedar Valley as the territory's first child advocacy attorney, the success of their unconventional family had inspired similar arrangements throughout the region. Patrick had earned admission to the Territorial University with plans to study journalism and law. Sean's artwork was being exhibited in galleries from Denver to San Francisco. The twins had both received apprenticeships that would prepare them for successful careers in engineering and music, and Brian had already been accepted to the Teachers College despite his youth. But perhaps most importantly, their story had demonstrated that families built on conscious choice and sustained by mutual love were often stronger than those created by mere biological connection, and that the greatest strength was found not in individual achievement, but in the bonds that allowed people to support each other through every challenge life could present. "Boys," Daniel said during the celebration dinner marking Thomas's return as a practicing attorney, "when I first brought you home from that terrible place, I thought I was just doing my duty as a lawman to protect children from abuse. I had no idea that you would end up saving me as much as I saved you." "We saved each other," Thomas replied, speaking for all of them. "And that's what families do. They choose to love each other through the worst times and celebrate together during the best ones." The sheriff, who had rescued a group of orphan boys from Cruelty, had indeed watched their bond grow into a family story that would inspire others for generations to come, proving that the strongest foundations were built not on blood or obligation, but on the conscious choice to care for each other, regardless of the challenges that choice might bring. Their legacy would extend far beyond their own happiness, influencing legislation, inspiring similar families throughout the territory, and demonstrating that love truly could triumph over even the worst circumstances when people were brave enough to choose each other and strong enough to keep choosing each other through every trial and triumph that life could offer. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more incredible stories of chosen family, second chances, and the power of love to transform even the darkest circumstances into something beautiful and meaningful. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of believers in the triumph of compassion over cruelty.